The reality is no one represents or articulates orthodoxy. For example, if we had the Patriarch of Constantinople on stage somewhere speaking about orthodoxy, perhaps half of the Orthodox world would say he in no way represents orthodoxy. He doesn't articulate orthodoxy. What he did in the Ukraine and what he says about ecumenism is anything but what Eastern Orthodoxy is. But he would say he represents orthodoxy, which would just inflame more passions. But then if we had him step down and brought up the Patriarch of Moscow, had him speak, those who follow the Patriarch of Constantinople, or maybe the portion of Ukraine who has been endorsed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, would turn around and say, well, he in no way represents orthodoxy, nor articulates it. In fact, it's a distortion and a deception. We could even bring up those who are in the one true Orthodox Church and say, well, all these so-called Orthodox churches that follow a false calendar, they don't represent or articulate orthodoxy. Bring up a well-known scholar like Father Alexander Shmemin of blessed memory, and many in Rokor or elsewhere will say that Father Alexander Shmemin was an innovator. He didn't represent or articulate orthodoxy. Some will say the same about Father Seraphim Rose, again of blessed memory. I had many priests complain to me about those who followed Elder Ephraim and still do. And they say, well, Elder Ephraim in no way speaks for nor represents orthodoxy. But then each of those people that I mentioned have their camps where they all say, well, no, the Patriarch of Constantinople certainly represents orthodoxy and articulates it. And then others will say, well, absolutely, the Patriarch of Moscow articulates and represents orthodoxy. Or they'll say Elder Ephraim and Athonite monasticism certainly represents orthodoxy. But who gets to say? No one. And that's the problem. Eastern Orthodoxy claims to have a sort of unified witness, but even its claim to say it has the consensus of the fathers is a claim. It's a claim. It's an argument. Father George Florovsky spoke of the neo-patristic synthesis. And so he, having joined the World Council of Churches, many will say, well, he doesn't represent orthodoxy and any of the other churches that have followed in his wake. Or if we look at the neo-patristic synthesis itself and say, well, which fathers do we select? Orthodoxy, following Constantine, moved more and more in its eschatology towards amillennialism, or what we would call approximates amillennialism. But in the first couple centuries of the church, we find the fathers typically espousing premillennialism. So when we talk about the consensus of the fathers, what do we mean? If we dig into Justin Martyr's Christology or some of the statements by Clement of Alexandria or Tertullian, do they represent the fathers? What does it mean when we say a patristic synthesis, where who synthesizes, who takes from who and says this is correct? And so the idea of Orthodox unity, and why I would call it a paper unity, it really is that. It's each person, each apologist, each convert to Orthodoxy, each cradle Orthodox person that grew up in the Orthodox Church, they all have a very distinct vision in many ways, in many instances, of who or what Orthodoxy is, which brings up one of the other valid points that someone raised in reference to the conversation that I had with Gavin, was that I received bad catechesis. And I could say, well, maybe that's true. And that is unfortunate. but I think the catechesis I received was fairly normal. And that's part of the tragedy. It required a lot of labor to rediscover even documents that were unpublished for over 100 years, like Dositheus, like St. Philaret of Moscow, like St. Peter Mogila, where we find these standard normative types of documents telling us what the Orthodox Church teaches. But if you look at authors that are passed around, like even St. Isaac of Nineveh or St. Isaac of Syria, who was famously a Universalist, he's considered, oh, you should read him. You should read a page a day of him. And you find contemporary authors like Olivier Clement, who also wrote in his Roots of Christian Mysticism many quotes from Universalist positions and perspectives. And so if someone says, oh, well, he came into Orthodoxy under these false pretenses, well, who gives the false pretenses? I think the answer becomes sort of plain, especially, if we read authors like Callistos Ware and Daring to Hope that all might be saved, or contemporary archpriests who are defending Origen, at some of the highest scholarly levels. Some of them have been deans of Orthodox theological seminaries. Did they represent Orthodoxy and articulate Orthodoxy when they were defending and continue to defend Origen, who was canonically anathematized in the Council of Trullo and thereafter, when those condemnations were affirmed again at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So if we ask the question, who gets to articulate and represent Orthodoxy, I think the sad truth is Orthodoxy is a cacophony. Orthodoxy is a chaos. It makes an argument, it makes an assertion that it has this unified witness and this unified vision. But even in the arguments and some of the ad hominem and critiques of me, just recently, some Orthodox Christian was viciously criticizing and attacking an Antiochian Orthodox Christian because they're not Orthodox enough. And so then you have the I'm out Orthodoxing you, and you won't out Orthodox me, I'll out Orthodox you. And so I think if we look at these claims of who gets to represent Orthodoxy, or what does it even mean to be properly in the Orthodox Church, well, that is an open question right now for Orthodoxy. The rejection of penal substitutionary atonement, when it's clearly evident in the Fathers, whether that's St. John Chrysostom or St. Cyril of Alexandria, or in Patriarch Jeremiah's conversations with the Lutherans. Clearly, penal substitutionary atonement, even though that can be nuanced in different ways, we can call it vicarious satisfaction, which is one of the members of, it's in the family of penal substitutionary atonement. We find that it's a normal belief, but now you find people coming out and saying, oh, well, those fools, forgive me for saying, who reject penal substitutionary atonement. Penal substitutionary atonement is very orthodox, they'll say. And then you'll have the other people come out and they'll say, oh, well, the one thing that we know is that penal substitutionary atonement is absolutely false. And everyone knows that Orthodoxy rejects penal substitutionary atonement. So when you go to the church where these pastors are pastoring, these priests are catechizing people, who gets to say who articulates? It seems like the people who articulate and represent Orthodoxy are those who just defend Orthodoxy. But if you step outside of that sort of, well, I'm not in the Orthodox Church, and now I'm going to say Orthodoxy teaches this, then you're going to have an army of people saying, well, no, we don't, or any number of combinations. So I don't really think that anyone articulates or represents Orthodoxy. And so I'll leave my comments here for now and pick them up later with another subject that came up. And so until then, God's peace be with you.